Welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here because we're jumping right into one of the most fascinating historical paradoxes I think I've ever come across. Today, we're unpacking the massive legacy behind 19th century translation through the unbelievable story of Robert Morrison. This was a man who defied an entire empire, not with armies or loud public speeches, but literally with a dictionary, a pen, and an absolutely unrelenting work ethic. He was a quiet clerk who pulled off a massive, world-altering success, but it's a success he'd never actually lived to see.
So think about this for a second. How do you measure a legacy you will never live to see? Seriously, we live in a world that is just obsessed with immediate metrics, right? We want instant gratification, rapid growth, viral views. But what happens when you pour your entire life into a monumental task, knowing full well you probably won't be around for the final payoff? To really grasp the stakes of this story, we have to travel back to one of the most impenetrable places on Earth for a foreigner at the time.
Okay, let's dive into this. Early 19th century China was essentially a closed empire. When the London Missionary Society sent Robert Morrison as the very first Protestant missionary to China back in 1807, they were sending him into an almost impossible situation. Foreign presence was tightly restricted. You couldn't just wander around. Christian evangelism was totally unwelcome. And perhaps most terrifyingly, if a Chinese citizen dared to teach a foreigner the language, they faced severe punishment from the government. Morrison was essentially walking straight up to a cultural fortress.
And just getting there was a monumental challenge. The East India Company, which controlled a massive chunk of Britain's trade with Asia, flat out refused to transport missionaries. They were basically history's least helpful travel agents. Because of that, Morrison had to take this incredibly long, roundabout route just to get to Macau in 1807. He couldn't just walk in and start preaching. He was confined to restricted trading areas. But by 1809, he finds a brilliant loophole, and by 1823, he pulls off the impossible.
So here is where the story gets super clever. Morrison needed a way to stay in the country legally and safely. In 1809, that very same East India Company that wouldn't even let him on their ships, they actually hired him as a Chinese translator and secretary. On paper, his official identity was just a corporate employee making a really comfortable salary of £500 a year. It gave him stability and totally unprecedented access. But underneath that official title was a secret mission. He was basically operating as a Trojan horse, working right under the authorities' noses to translate a forbidden book, the Bible.
Now, obviously, you can't translate a massive book if you don't deeply understand the language. For Morrison, this wasn't just some casual weekend studying. This was a grueling, all-consuming intellectual struggle. He didn't just learn one dialect. He tackled classical Chinese, Cantonese, and Mandarin. He had to master thousands of highly complex characters and navigate literary conventions that were completely different from English. And he did all of this in secret, isolated from normal society, working with incredibly brave Chinese tutors who risked harsh government punishment just for helping him. Against all odds, this isolated foreigner gradually became one of the leading Western students of the Chinese language.
And this brings us to his brilliant strategic pivot. He had this mindset, perfectly captured in this idea. If he could not freely preach the Bible, he would translate it. Morrison recognized a fundamental truth about information. Literature can travel where a physical person simply cannot. A translated book could slip past the strict geographical borders placed on foreigners. It could secretly enter homes, be copied by hand, be read in total privacy, and most crucially, it could survive long after the missionary was gone.
And this brilliantly illustrates the true legacy behind 19th century translation. His desk, just a simple, wooden desk sitting in a restricted trading zone, effectively became the ultimate nexus point. It was a cultural bridge between the East and the West. Think about it. He was taking the foundational text of the Western world and meticulously encoding it into the foundational language of the Eastern world.
But here's the catch. Having a translated manuscript just sitting on your desk doesn't do anyone any good. You have to actually reproduce it. And this is where traditional Chinese printing technology offered a remarkable stealthy solution. Forget bulky Western printing presses that would be loud and obvious. Morrison and his team used woodblock printing. They carefully carved the translated text onto wooden blocks in reverse, applied ink, and printed it onto paper over and over again. It was the perfect way to mass-produce the scriptures along with hymns and tracts, completely under the radar.
But the timeline to actually pull this off,
It was staggering. We're talking years of agonizing character-by-character labor. It took roughly 6 years just to complete the New Testament, around 1813. Then, teaming up with another missionary named William Milne, who helped translate huge portions, it took another 5 years to finish the Old Testament by 1818. Just let that sink in. By 1823, a major printed edition of the entire Chinese Protestant Bible was published, all within a little over a decade of the very first Protestant missionaries setting foot in China.
But what you have to understand is that Morrison's legacy isn't just about religious texts. He was building something much, much broader. He was building infrastructure. He realized that if the East and the West were ever going to truly understand each other, they needed foundational tools. He wasn't just preaching. He was systematically forging the linguistic keys that would eventually allow future diplomats, secular scholars, and international traders to deeply engage with Chinese culture.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how his colossal literary legacy breaks down into these distinct, far-reaching categories. There was the complete Chinese Protestant Bible, of course, but he also compiled a massive, groundbreaking Chinese-English dictionary that became an absolute game-changer for Western scholars and diplomats. On top of that, he had the incredible foresight to establish the Anglo-Chinese College at Malacca, with Milne's help, to train future leaders and teachers. He was literally laying the groundwork for an entire future generation.
However, we absolutely cannot talk about this incredible legacy without acknowledging the devastating personal cost it took on him. This was not some cushy desk job. Morrison spent years completely isolated from normal society. He endured severe health struggles and just deep, deep emotional loneliness. And most tragically, his family paid a heavy price. He married Mary Morton in 1809, but she tragically died of cholera while their children were still young. The emotional and physical toll of this 27-year mission was just enormous.
And after all of that, the isolation, the tragic loss, the decades of painstaking translation, do you know how many Chinese converts he baptized in his lifetime? 10. Just 10. Let that tiny number sink in for a second. After nearly 3 decades of agonizing daily labor, the visible immediate result was just around 10 people.
Which leads us to a really uncomfortable question, especially by our modern standards. Was his mission a failure? If you brought a modern corporate consultant in to look at Morrison's life, they'd look at the 27 years invested, the immense suffering, the 10 conversions, and they would probably say, yeah, this was a massive failure of ROI. But looking at it that way completely misses the paradox of his life's work.
So the crucial point is that you have to separate immediate results from historical legacy. Yes, the immediate visible harvest was microscopic. He died long before the Great Opening of China. But his historical legacy, it changed 2 worlds. He literally laid the foundation for Chinese Protestant Christianity. He created the essential linguistic resources that shaped cross-cultural communication for an entire century. His significance lies entirely in the massive foundation he built, not the immediate numbers he logged.
At his core, Robert Morrison was a deeply defiant man. But he wasn't a political revolutionary leading an army or trying to overthrow a government. His defiance was quieter, yet incredibly profound. He flat out refused to believe that closed doors meant an impossible mission. When public preaching was restricted, he just pivoted to translation. When the language seemed impossible, he just relentlessly studied. He completely refused to measure his obedience and his success by immediate results.
Let's move to and see how this builds into his final chapter. Morrison died in Canton in August 1834 and was buried in Macau. His epitaph highlights all these incredible achievements, but there's a single quote that captures his true spirit better than anything else. The person who plants the seed may never live to see the tree. Morrison worked in the dark so that future generations could see. He planted a massive field, knowing full well he would never be around to see the harvest.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought for you to chew on today. Are you building a legacy that will outlast your lifetime? In a world that constantly demands instant gratification, Robert Morrison's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the absolute most important work we can do is foundational. It's the quiet, meticulous work of translation, of building bridges, and of planting seeds that will grow long after we are gone. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep building, and I'll catch you next time.